Thank you very much, Lance. Pleasure to finally be here in Portland. I've read so much about it, and though I've only been here for a little more than 24 hours, I can say it is even more beautiful than I expected it to be, so thank you very much. It's a pleasure to tell you today about a program that I've worked on now for several years called ALS Untangled, and I've called this talk Reopening the X-Files. Now, I told you I haven't been here before, so I don't know for sure that this part of the country ever got this X-Files TV show. Did it come here? Okay, I'm just kidding. In fact, I think it was shot in Vancouver, not far from here, from what I understand. So just in case there's somebody that doesn't know what this was pretty much my favorite TV show of all time. And it was a show about a guy named Fox Mulder. When he was a kid, he was supposed to be watching his little sister, Samantha, and she disappeared. And the way he remembered it, she was kidnapped by aliens. And so he spent the rest of his life trying to prove to people who didn't believe him that aliens and similarly bizarre phenomena existed. And so the TV show every week would start off with some strange phenomenon, and then Mulder and his team would investigate it, and usually they would find some sort of rational explanation. Well, this was my own Samantha. She was a 60-year-old university professor that came to my clinic, unfortunately had a pretty obvious case of ALS. She was still pretty early in the course of the disease when I met her for the first time, so just a little bit of slurred speech, easily intelligible, a little more weakness in her arms and legs, but she could still do things for herself, and she could still walk well with just a cane and a brace. And she had no obvious cognitive or behavioral problems. So I sat down with her and I had that terrible talk about the fact that I thought this was what she had and what that meant. And I presented her with options that were appropriate to where she was in the course of the disease, including riluzole, multidisciplinary care, and participation in one of my research studies. And what she said was, yeah, no problem about the riluzole, and I'd love to come to your clinic, but I'm going to pass on your research studies because I've decided I'm going to do something called hyperbaric oxygen therapy, something I read about on the internet. And in fact, the website I went to said this was the fountain of youth, healing, and total cellular rejuvenation. So how can I pass that up? And on that same website, there was a testimonial from a guy named Kim Cherry, who said that since he started hyperbaric oxygen therapy, he was regaining lost motor function. So for the purposes of this talk today, hyperbaric oxygen is an example of something which I call an alternative or off-label therapy. And I abbreviate AOT, and I define those as things that are advertised to slow, stop, or even reverse ALS progression without what most of us would consider to be very good evidence. Now, as you might imagine, when this professor told me this, my face looked a little bit like that of Fox Mulder when he first, found out that there really were aliens, that he could prove it. And as I drove home from clinic that day, I said to myself, I wonder if this is a common thing, that people with ALS go on the internet and find things that they try and don't tell their doctors about. And it turns out, whether you survey patients or you survey their doctors, the answer is the same. The majority of people with ALS will try at least one of these AOTs over the course of their illness. So the next question is why? And for everybody in this room, the answer is obvious. This is one of the world's worst diseases. And in spite of more than 100 years of efforts, we don't have any way to slow, stop, or reverse it. We do have some exciting things in trials, but we don't know how far off the answer is going to be. And so like the slogan on this old X-Files poster, patients and families want to believe that there's something better out there. And in fact, if you ask them specifically, what are you looking for when you go on the internet, 10% of people say they think they're going to find the cure for ALS, 20% say they think they're going to find something to make them better, and 50% say they think they're going to find something that will slow their progression. Other answers that I've heard when I ask people the question of, why are you out there looking? Peer pressure is a very common one. What does that mean? Well, a lot of times patients tell me, I'm not sure what to do, but I've got a cousin who's in school to become a nurse practitioner, and she went on the internet last weekend and she said, this is what I should do. So everybody in my family now thinks this is what I should do, so that's peer pressure. And then my favorite one, which I hear very often, is, Doc, I already have ALS. What worse could possibly happen to me? So on that background comes the internet, which makes it easier than ever for people who are selling AOTs to connect with people who want them. In fact, if you go home and do a Google search of the words ALS treatment, you will come up with more than 40 million hits. Now, not all of those are AOTs, but many of them are. In fact, some of the first ones that come up are usually stem cell clinics in a foreign land. The reason they come up first is because people actually pay to have their things come up first on Google searches. The other thing about the internet is that there's no such thing as internet police. So if you put up a website and decide to sell something, you can say pretty much whatever you want about it, and nobody can hold you to it. So very commonly, if you look up ALS AOTs, you find the following phrases: quote unquote, clinically proven, and quote unquote, perfectly safe. So just to illustrate my point, this is a screenshot from a website from something called MotoTab. So this was actually something that a patient asked me about one day in clinic, and they said, Doc, let me show you something that I'm thinking about trying. What do you think of this? I said, to be honest, I've never heard of it. And they said, Doc, I thought you were an ALS expert. This says it's the world's most relied upon treatment for motor neuron disease, and you don't know what it is? No. So did a little research, and over here on the right-hand side, you can see in this column over here, it says that this is clinically proven, and down here it says it's perfectly safe, it's completely guaranteed. You're at no risk for trying this. So my advice about the internet in general is like another X-Files movie poster slogan, trust no one. So the information that is used to back up a lot of the claims about AOTs is not always accurate. In fact, it can range anywhere from absent to flawed to just completely wrong. And let me give you some examples. So going back to this website, MotoTab, you can see over here on this side next to this blue arrow that it says that there's a study that proves that MotoTab works. Okay? So you click on the link and you get this. It says clinical study soon will be posted here. You look back and you say, well, how old is this website? Well, the website's been up now for more than a decade. So I don't know what kind of clinical study takes more than 10 years to upload, but it must really be something. Now, to be fair to these folks, they do have a link to what seems to be an independent group. So MotoTab comes from a group called Oslo Health Solutions, presumably in Oslo, Norway. And they have a link on their website to what seems to be an independent group from Glasgow, Scotland, called the Society for the Promotion of Alternative Health. And they have done some testing of MotoTab and compared it to two other products that I've never heard of before, Ronotin and Neurotax, and they've tested it on some strange assays, okay? So one of the assays says traditionally proven, one says clinically tested, one says worldwide usage, and one says short-term focus. None of those assays are defined, nor is it explained what all these check marks mean. Presumably more check marks is better, but it never actually says that. And if more check marks are better, you have to wonder why, if only one of those three products was clinically tested, because the other two have no check marks, why does it come in second when they rank the three products? We'll get more to that later. So much more difficult for patients, families, and even doctors to sift through is flawed information. And there's a lot more of that out there. So this is a graph that once came off a website for the world's most profitable stem cell clinic. It was called the X Cell Center, and it was located in Germany. And so their idea was that you would take a person's stem cells out of their bone marrow, and you would inject those stem cells back into the spinal fluid and the muscle, and they would secrete growth factors and people would get stronger. It's not that crazy of an idea. In fact, you probably know that there's a trial underway to do something very similar from a company called Brainstem. And so on this particular website, they had this graph what happened to patients with ALS who went to the XL Center. And this is from a cohort of 53 patients who went there. And you can see from looking at this bar graph that the vast majority of patients were either stable or improved after they got the stem cells. And that's not the natural history of ALS, right? So that looks really good. But something's missing here. It doesn't actually say what was being measured. And so nowhere on the website did it say it. We actually had to get in touch with the people at the XL Center to find out what exactly they were measuring. What they were doing is calling people on the telephone about a week after they had their stem cells and asking them, which of these categories do you fit into? Are you worse? Are you the same, better, or a lot better? So let's think about that for a second. Have you ever heard of something called the placebo effect? So a placebo effect is sometimes somebody wants to be better so bad that even if they're given a placebo, a substance that doesn't do anything, that's inert, they actually convince themselves that they're better. And there's been a lot of research on the placebo effect. It's most likely to happen when an intervention is very expensive. So to get these stem cells, it was $20,000. A placebo effect is most likely to happen when something's invasive. So to get this procedure, you had to travel to Germany and you had to have a bone marrow biopsy, a spinal tap, and injections into your muscle. So it's pretty invasive. To have a placebo effect, it's most likely when you're measuring something that's kind of nebulous, like when it's subjective, when it's a feeling that a person has as opposed to something that a separate person measures. And that's true here too. And finally, it's most likely to happen when you measure something right after a treatment. Do you think a week is really enough time for stem cells to do anything that would be measurably important? Probably not. So this was almost certainly a placebo effect. This is another one. The XL Center, by the way, is out of business, but this is still being sold. It's called the Diana Protocol. Have you heard of that one? Anybody ever heard of that one? So this is a collection of supplements that was developed by a retired orthopedic surgeon named Dr. Vincent Tadone to try to help his daughter, who reportedly was diagnosed with ALS. So he went to the library, did some research on ALS, and he came up with a collection of supplements that he thought would help her. And then he started to market these supplements to other folks, and the exact combination changes over the years. But there's been one paper about this. It was a highly flawed animal study. And in the paper, there was a comment that said, our experience in patients with ALS is that it has a success rate of 85%. Holy cow. That really jumps out at you in an animal study that they tested this in people and the success rate was 85%. What are they talking about? Well, if you read the fine print, they had approximately 40 ALS FRS-R scores. So the ALS FRS-R is a scale, it's a symptom-based scale. We ask patients 12 questions when they come to clinic. How well do you speak? How well do you swallow? How well do you use your arms? And we score those things from 0, which means no function at all there, to 4, which means normal. And so over time, this scale usually deteriorates in people. And on average, it deteriorates at a rate of about 1 point per month. So what they said was, well, 40 people sent us their scores over time, and 85% of them had a deterioration rate that was less than 1 point per month. So therefore, the Diana Protocol must be the reason why they're progressing so slowly. Well, wait a second. First of all, we don't have before and after scores on these people. We just have scores. And second of all, have you ever heard of something called a selection bias? So what if there were 10,000 people on the Diana Protocol and only 40 sent in their scores? Do you think it would be the 40 people who didn't notice anything that sent in their scores? No, it'd be the 40 people who felt like they were doing well on it. So you can't just look at a small subset of people who might have felt like they were doing well. You got to know how many people actually were on this thing in the first place. So I don't think we can really believe that assay either. And then finally we get to this, which in my opinion is the most difficult kind of information to sift through. This is the kind that sounds really good the first time you read it, except upon further review, it's completely wrong. So this is a section of what I personally think is the most interesting website I've ever read. It's for a guy named Dean Kraft, K-R-A-F-T. And he calls himself the world's most documented energy healer. And his website really is like an episode of The X-Files. It's full of all these little stories, little letters that people wrote that said that they watched this guy do something that should not be physically possible. So for example, you click on this one and it says, to whom it may concern, in January of 1975, I watched Dean Kraft move a pendulum that was under a glass jar using only his mind, signed John Smith. I mean, who knows if any of these are accurate? You can't find any of these people to talk to them, right? But on the website, there's a whole section about a person named Nelda Boos, who was supposedly diagnosed with ALS at one of America's best medical centers, and supposedly progressed to where she was completely immobilized, quadriplegic, and apparently was literally getting ready to die, actually picking out the outfit that she was going to be buried in. And then she went to Dean Kraft, and 2 years later, she's back to normal. So that's not supposed to happen with ALS, so that really sounds amazing. So nowadays, with social media, you can find just about anybody, right? So I went on Facebook, and I asked people, anybody ever heard of Nelda Boos? And a friend of hers connected us. And I spoke to her on the phone, and she said, that's absolutely correct, what it says on that website. And then I asked her to send me her medical records, and I'll never forget those coming in the mail and going through those, and about 2 o'clock in the morning, turning to my wife who was asleep, and I said, hey, you know how people already think I'm totally crazy with the hair and the clothes? Wait till the next ALS meeting when I stand up in front of everybody and I say, I found the cure for ALS, energy healing. Because as I read through those records, I was completely convinced that this lady had ALS. I mean, she really had all the right tests, and she was diagnosed by somebody I have great respect for at another major academic institution. And she really did progress to where she couldn't move anything. And now 2 years later, she is, if not completely, almost entirely back to normal. So I started talking to some folks who'd been around a lot longer than I have in ALS. And they said, there's an old literature on this. There's some papers that people have kind of forgotten about from 20 years ago. So it turns out that ALS can actually get better. There are these very rare examples, including published examples of people who, for all the world, look like they have this disease and progress for a while and then get better. And we're going to talk more about those in a little while. But there's a lot of possible explanation for these folks, not just the fact that some unusual treatment might have worked. Nonetheless, in my opinion, these are so rare that when we find somebody who has one, if they tried something, along the same time that they got better, I think we should try that exact same thing in more people, no matter how weird it might sound. So I said, I don't know what energy healing is. It doesn't obey the laws of physics as I understand them, but nonetheless, I would like to try Dean Kraft's energy healing in some more of my patients. And so I reached out to him, I emailed him, and I said, this is where I am, and I'll pay for you to come here to Duke, or I'll pay to fly my patients up there and pay you for your energy healing. And if you could just make one more person better, I mean, we're really onto something huge here. And I'll never forget his response. It was an email, and it said, Richard, for those who believe, no proof is necessary. And for those who do not, no proof will ever be enough. Signed, Dean Kraft. That's the last I ever heard of him. So we'll never know. So, we all get a chuckle out of these little vignettes, but this is really a problem, right? It's a problem because there are real harms that have come to patients who have pursued these AOTs, even on websites where it says these things are perfectly safe. Clearly, there have been financial harms done to people. So some of these things cost hundreds, some thousands, some hundreds of thousands of dollars. There clearly have been psychological harms done to people. You know how hard it was to hear that you had ALS? Imagine somebody telling you, well, that doesn't have to be, the way the doctor explained it to you doesn't have to be true. If you can just raise enough money, sell enough stuff, take enough loans, I can make you better. And then over time, as you realize that's not happening and that you have ALS and all this debt, imagine how you would feel. There are real physical harms that have come to people. So the most dramatic of these harms have come from people who pursued something called stem cell tourism. In other words, they went off the grid to a foreign country and bought stem cells, and often this is for something other than ALS. Now there's multiple examples of this. The most recent was just last week in the New England Journal of Medicine. Multiple examples of people paying large sums to be injected with stem cells, coming back to the United States and finding that they have new neurological symptoms, finding that they have a tumor someplace in their brain or spinal cord, and finding out that that tumor is not comprised of their cells. In other words, they paid a lot of money to go to a foreign country and be injected with cancer cells. This is really happening out there because there's not a lot of oversight in these countries. And just in people with ALS, we have found examples of infections and blood clots and heart attacks and even deaths from some of these AOTs that were never reported, even in clinics that continue to advertise themselves as perfectly safe. One of the most subtle examples of harms that can come from pursuit of AOTs is actually scientific harms. And this has to do with a problem that you might not know about. So, we talked about some of the excitement in clinical trials in the last talk, but one of the real problems that we have is that less than 10% of people with ALS enroll in our clinical trials. The average clinical trial enrolls about 2 people per site per month. Even in a clinic like mine, where I probably see somewhere on the order of 70 to 80 people a month with ALS, we enroll about 2 in an average month. And there's a lot of reasons for this, which we can get into in the question and answer session, but one answer is exactly what happened with Samantha, and that is that people choose to pursue an AOT to self-experiment as opposed to coming into a clinical trial. And there are consequences. As a result of this, our trials are taking longer, they're costing more than they should. They might actually end without an answer. There are examples of trials that have just closed down because they just couldn't enroll patients. Even if we do finish a clinical trial and only a tiny percentage of people with ALS come in, we don't know if we can generalize the results of our trial to everybody else. The bottom line is that until we fix this problem, it's going to take us longer than it should to find a cure for ALS. And that's just not acceptable to any of us. So what do we do about this? Well, it turns out that there's 4 models by which decisions get made in any doctor-patient relationship. So the oldest of these models is called paternalism. In that model, the doctor is acting like a parent or a guardian, and the patient's job is just to do whatever the doctor says. So if I was going to try to work with Samantha through paternalism, I would say, Samantha, I appreciate that website's very interesting, but I just can't believe that that's true. I think that you would do much better coming into one of my clinical trials. I really think that's what you should do. Another model, a newer model that's fueled by the internet, is an autonomous model. So there, the patient is at the center of the equation, and it's assumed that whatever the patient wants to do is the right thing, that they've thought a lot about this, that they've made a decision that's a good decision based on accurate information, and the doctor's job is just to do whatever the patient wants them to, basically to be a vending machine. You want to do hyperbaric oxygen, Samantha? Absolutely. How can I help? You need me to write a prescription for hyperbaric oxygen? Here you go. And then there's some newer models. So there's 2 of these. One is called consumerism, and the other one is called shared decision making. And in both of these, the patient is at the center. Ultimately what they decide to do, their values and goals are paramount. But the doctor has a little greater role here. So in consumerism, the doctor's job is to kind of be like a living version of Wikipedia. Okay, hyperbaric oxygen, let me do some research, and I'll get back to you and tell you what I think the pros are and the cons are. And then in shared decision making, the doctor can even take it one step further. And they can say, okay, here's the pros, here's the cons, and if you want my opinion based on all my years of training and experience, here's what I think you should do. So, each of these models has strengths and weaknesses, right? So in terms of paternalism, doctors really do have the most years of training and experience to be able to evaluate scientific data. Plus, this model has been around for hundreds of years since the dawn of medicine. So there must be something about it that satisfies both parties. Of course, there are also some weaknesses. This assumes that all patients are the same, and that's not true. So one thing that we know that's different about patients is that they like to have their information given to them in different ways. So the literature talks about 3 different groups. One group is called active seekers. These are people who want to know everything about ALS the minute you tell them that's what they have. They want a fire hose of information. Much more common are selective seekers. They just want a trickle of information. Doc, let's talk about what we need to know to get through the next few months and not get too far ahead. And then the hardest group is called information avoiders. Those are people who just want to pretend this is not happening. They don't want to hear anything more about it. They would rather have all their information filtered through somebody else, maybe in their family or a friend. The worst part about paternalism is that it can, and it has been abused, both at the bedside and in clinical research. And those abuses have actually led to things like modern malpractice law and informed consent law that protect patients at the bedside and in trials. So autonomy has some strengths and weaknesses. So strengths, obviously, what the patient wants should be at the center of the whole relationship. And also this allows people to proceed with information gathering at their own pace. But of course, here the doctor is just relegated to a vending machine. All those years of training and experience are wasted in this relationship. And furthermore, we've already talked about the fact that the information that patients and families are using to base really important decisions may not be accurate. And so finally we come to these in-between models, which bring out the best of both parties, that what the patient wants is at the center, but the doctor is able to use all those years of training and experience to maybe help the patient refine their decisions. The big problem with shared decision-making models, these in-between models, they take a lot more time. So you can imagine it's so much faster for me to just say to Samantha, nah, don't do that. Or, yeah, go for it, than it is for me to say, hyperbaric oxygen. Well, let me go home and do some research on this. And after several hours of research in the library, I'll get back to you and we'll go through all the pros and cons and I'll give you an opinion about what I think might be going on. It might not seem like a lot, but imagine that I see 20 patients that day and I have 19 different AOTs that people ask me about. You can quickly see that there will not be any time for me to eat, sleep, or say hello to my wife. I'll just be in the library all the time researching AOTs. So what do we do? Well, the good news is it's pretty clear that most doctors and most patients prefer the same thing. They prefer shared decision-making. Interestingly, shared decision-making is also associated with better compliance and better health outcomes, at least in hypertension and diabetes. It's probably not that surprising, right? Imagine as a patient that you had a little bit of say in how you were going to manage your blood pressure or your diabetes. You would probably be a lot more likely to follow through with the treatment plan. And if you did, you'd be a lot more likely to do well than if you just came home and said, boy, that doctor's a real jerk. I'm not taking this medicine. I don't like all the possible side effects. We didn't even talk about it. So your blood pressure probably wouldn't get any better. So if we're going to do shared decision-making, what do we do about the time issue? Well, the answer came to me back in 2007. I'm sitting at International Symposium on Motor Neuron Disease. And one of my European colleagues, Dr. Vandenberg, did something very interesting. So Vandenberg's patients had asked him about a clinic in Beijing, China. At the time, it was very popular. And there was a Dr. Huang who was injecting fetal olfactory cells into the forebrain of people with ALS. So he would grind up these aborted fetuses, isolate this one group of cells, drill a hole in your skull, and with a needle inject these cells into the front of your brain. And on his website, he was claiming that 70% of patients with ALS were improving and that it was perfectly safe. So Vandenberg did something interesting. He wanted to do the ultimate shared decision-making. He went to the clinic. He interviewed Dr. Huang. He reviewed all of his processes and informed consent. He even followed some of his patients, 7 of his patients afterward, with objective measurements to see what happened. And what he found was that nobody had any objective benefit. Even just in those 7 patients, he found some significant harms. One had a blood clot. One actually died from respiratory failure a few days after the operation. And yet the clinic had not reported any of this. Also, that the cost was quite high, $25,000.
And so Vandenberg did something, again, interesting, didn't just get back to the patients who asked him about this. He shared his shared decision-making with the world, so that now, when any of us had a patient ask about this, we could just point to his paper that he wrote about this. We didn't have to reinvent the wheel and do this ourselves. So that's what I decided to do, ramp this up on an industrial scale, create a model of shared decision-making regarding AOTs. And I started it in 2009 within a group called the ALS Research Group. And again, our goal was to build a team that could systematically assess these AOTs with the goal of just helping patients and families make more informed decisions about what they were going to do. And there's 3 parts to this. So the first part is, where do we get our ideas? The second part is, how do we actually do these reviews? And then finally, how do we get the information back to the people that asked about it? So we wanted to make it as easy as possible for patients and families to get us ideas. So we have lots of ways. You can ask your doctor about these things and they'll pass the information off to one of us, usually to me. You can just email me. My email address is all over the internet, so feel free to email me about these AOTs. Most of our questions about AOTs come in through Twitter. And so for those of you that don't use it, there's some nice things about Twitter. You don't have to remember anybody's name or email address. If you send a tweet out that says, I'm wondering about this chelation clinic that just opened up here in Eugene, Oregon, ALS Untangled, check it out. Every night I mine the entire Twitter universe for the word ALS Untangled. And if there's any AOTs in there that I don't know about, I put them on a list and eventually they get on our website. So another nice thing about Twitter is you can get an idea of how many people are actually interested in what you're doing by looking at your number of Twitter followers. And so just this month I was so excited because we crossed what I thought was a milestone, 2,500 Twitter followers. I came home, I told my wife about it, and she said, did you know Lady Gaga has 33 million Twitter followers? And my response was, but she has her own stylist, I have to put these looks together myself. That's probably part of the reason. So you can also look at the number of tweets that you're getting, and really since the beginnings of this program, since 2012, we've been averaging at least 1 tweet per day. And all that activity has created a problem I never knew we would have, and that is, on our website we have a list of all the things that people have asked us about that we haven't gotten to yet. Those are called the open queries. And that number is now more than 200. We have more than 200 AOTs that people have asked us about that we haven't gotten to. And so because these things take time, about 40 hours each, these reviews, we've had to come up with some way to rank these. And so we have a vote button next to all the AOTs. And so if you go home tonight and you go on our website, I would encourage you to click the vote button next to the AOT that you want us to review. And that way it rises up toward the top and I know which I need to focus on next. And you can see that we've got a lot of votes. Several of these have, more than 1,000 votes. Luckily, it's not just me doing this. Just like Fox Mulder had a team to help him with his X-Files investigation, so do I. And the team has really exploded, from the early days when we had about 30 people, mostly American, to now when we have more than 100 clinicians and scientists from across 10 different countries working on these together. Mostly we work on these through email. So we've got sort of a standard operating protocol, and that is one of us, usually me, writes the first review. We have to gather all the information, put it all down on a review, and then send it out to the team for comments. And nobody's ever done anything quite like this before in any field, so we had to really develop a science. We had to say, how should we try to get information about these? There should be some standardized way. So first we try to contact the person who's selling it to get their side of the story. We try to collect all the materials that they're using to advertise this so we know what claims are being made. We search a database called PubMed, which is scientific publications. We poll the ALS Untangled team to find out if any of us have any patients that have ever used this, and if so, what happened. We do a Google search, and what comes up there is information from chat rooms. So we look at a lot of things in chat rooms, and sometimes that can be a humbling experience, let me tell you, when you read about some of the things people say about you in chat rooms. But Yeah, so we do also find out about people's experience with AOTs by going in there. We look on a giant database called PROACT. So it's the largest existing database of patients with ALS in which there are longitudinal outcome measures. There are close to 10,000 patients in that database that have longitudinal outcome measures, and included in there is information about treatments that they were using. Also, we look at an online community called Patients Like Me, which I think is terrific. And so there, people actually input their own outcome measures as well as their own treatments. And we can get an idea of whether there's any relationship between people doing well or poorly and some of these treatments. And then last but not least, just like Vandenberg, we tried to visit the clinic and we tried to talk to the proponent, we tried to interview the patients that are there, and we tried to follow some of the folks. We had some people a couple of years ago raise concerns about the fact that this seemed to be somewhat subjective, the way that we were reviewing these things. And so we tried to make it as objective as we could. Again, this is new ground because no one's looking at this kind of information in any field. We created something called a table of evidence. So this is something that the team of 100 of us started with a draft and it went around and around, basically crowdsourced how to do this. And this is what we came up with. Every AOT is graded in 5 categories. Mechanistic plausibility, preclinical evidence, that means like did this thing ever get dumped onto any ALS model, a cell culture model, an animal model? If so, what happened? Case reports, trials, and finally risks. And in each of those 5 categories, we've got different letter grades. A is really good, F is really bad, and there's specific cutoffs for moving to the next grade. And you can read more about those on our website. I won't take you through every one of those. There's also a category U, which means there's just not enough information to grade that AOT in that particular category. It comes up most often in preclinical. A lot of these things have never been given to a preclinical model. And so then finally, how do we get the information back? So this is actually a written paper, and the papers tend to have the same format, 1,500 words, a very standard way that they're written. These drafts go around and around, and I keep trying to incorporate everybody's suggestions and comments until finally the group seems to be happy. And then once we are, I submit this to a journal called ALS and Frontotemporal Degeneration, and the editor of the journal makes any final comments or edits, and then it gets published. And all of these ALS Untangled reviews are published by something called free open access, which means unlike just about every other article in that journal, and in most journals, you don't have to pay to read these. You can just download these for free. And so we've been chugging along with our completed reviews. We were averaging about 4 reviews a year up until the past year when we got some additional support from the ALS Association that has allowed me to carve out more time to spend on this. And so we've now about doubled our output. So it looks like we'll be able to do 7 or 8 reviews per year now, as long as that support holds out. And anytime you want to know, whether there's a review that's already been done on something you're thinking about, go onto our website and click the tab Completed Reviews, and there you can see the names of the 35 things that we've reviewed. You can see immediately what grades we gave each of those things for the 5 categories. And if you want to read the whole paper, just click on the name, and the paper just downloads for free, and you can read it. So for the next part of this talk, I just want to turn my attention to some of the surprising lessons that I've learned running this program now for the past 7 years. The first one is about the people, the proponents that sell these AOTs. I will admit, when I went into this, I thought these people kind of looked like this guy in this cartoon, that they were all Wild West snake oil salesmen. And we certainly have found a few snake oil salesmen. So for example, this guy is probably the worst of the worst. His name's Larry Stowe. We actually were contacted by 60 Minutes to work with them to investigate this man who had a clinic in Mexico where he was calling himself Dr. Larry Stowe, had a concoction of stem cells and supplements that he was selling to people with different diseases, including ALS, at a cost of $150,000. Was telling people that they would be able to get up out of their wheelchair and get back to walking in a few months if they could just raise enough money to have this. And that he was working with several American institutions and the FDA to get this fully approved because it was working so well. So 60 Minutes helped us figure out that this guy was not a medical doctor, the degree on his wall was fake, none of the American institutions or the FDA had ever heard of this guy. And when the program, 21st Century Snake Oil, came out on 60 Minutes, this guy disappeared. I'm happy to say that the FBI finally caught him, and he's now in jail. What about this group? We said there was something funny about this. Well, we reached out to these people as part of our SOP, contacted Oslo Health Solutions in Oslo, Norway, never heard back. So we did a Google search, and we said, I wonder if this company does anything else. And much to our surprise, it turns out that this company has dozens of websites that look exactly the same, except for the beginning of the product name and the indication. So Mototab for motor neuron disease, Peritab for peripheral neuropathy, Osteotab for osteomyelitis, and on and on and on. The pictures are the same, the text is the same, even that little button that says clinical study soon to be posted here, exactly the same, okay? But we did say that there seemed to be an independent group that validated the claims here somehow. We didn't really understand how. And that was this group from Glasgow, Scotland, Society for the Promotion of Alternative Health. So we reached out to them and we got no response. So we Googled those guys, and guess what? They also have dozens of virtually identical websites where they compare a product that ends in tab to a product that ends in tin to a product that ends in tax on those strange assays, and the assays come out exactly the same way every time. So then when I was explaining this to a patient, came up to me after one of these sessions and said, did you ever try to figure out who owns those actual websites? You can use something called the who is function and find out who really owns a website. So we did that day together, and it turns out that all these websites for both Oslo Health Solutions and the Society for the Promotion of Alternative Health are owned by the same two brothers whose address is in Pakistan. So this clearly does seem to be a scam. But a lot more of these proponents are what I call true believers. They're good people who really want to help folks and really think they have something that works. They just don't understand science very well. So this is one of those guys. His name is Dr. Joe Hickey. He runs a clinic on Hilton Head, South Carolina called the Hickey Wellness Center. I went down there, spent a few days with him. And his belief is that heavy metals cause ALS and many other diseases. How do I know that Dr. Hickey is a true believer? Well, he and his wife showed me the insides of their mouths, and they've had all their fillings removed. And I watched him and his wife chelate each other to suck the metals out of each other's body when the clinic ended at night. So they're actually doing this treatment to themselves to try to stave off any neurodegenerative diseases. So I can't fault his belief. Not only that, but some of these proponents actually do some things at the bedside really well that mainstream doctors, especially ALS doctors, need to learn from. So when I was at Dr. Hickey's clinic, I asked his patients, tell me your story, how did you wind up here? Every one of them told me the same thing. We started in a mainstream clinic. Very often it was a big famous name clinic. And we just felt like it was all gloom and doom. Like nobody had any optimism. Nobody wanted to talk about any of the exciting research. And when we would bring up something, we would just be shut down. Like we asked about chelation, they just laughed at us and told us it's just a waste of money. Very paternalistic. And then they also said sometimes they would send questions in by email or call in, and they would never get a response, or it would be days or weeks. So Dr. Hickey was the exact opposite of all this. The most optimistic guy I think I've ever met. Incredibly respectful, almost to a fault. I remember one of his patients saying, I don't know, doc, if this chelation's helping me, but I read something about Lyme disease. Could that be causing my problem? Lyme disease? Well, it could. You want me to treat you for Lyme disease? All right, I'll hook up some antibiotics right now. And then responsiveness, incredible. So it didn't matter what time we finished seeing patients, Dr. Hickey would make sure every phone call, every email were returned before he went home that night. And I just think those are the three key things for ALS doctors. We've got to be optimistic. We've got to be respectful of our patients. And we've got to be responsive to their questions. So the other set of lessons I learned that really shocked me were the lessons about the treatments themselves. And again, I'm going to be honest, I went into this thinking that these things were going to be about as bogus as this old picture of Bigfoot. And we sure have found a lot of bogus things. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will tell you that there are some red flags that you might want to remember. You know, if you're on the internet and you see something that we haven't looked at, ask yourself these questions. Is this thing advertising itself as dramatically effective against a large number of the world's worst diseases? If so, beware. Somebody that actually has a treatment that works for ALS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, MS, lung cancer, brain tumors, fibromyalgia, and diabetic neuropathy, why would they be practicing in a strip mall next to a Kentucky Fried Chicken? They should be the most famous, wealthy person in the history of the world if they had something like that. Anything that's advertised as perfectly safe, beware. Nothing's perfectly safe. People have side effects from placebos. Anytime there's a lack of oversight, there's no independent group that's reviewing what this clinic is doing, there's no informed consent for you to sign so that you know exactly what you're getting into, there's not an MD for you to talk to, there's a large out-of-pocket upfront expense before you even know what you're getting, beware. It's a lot to remember, but if you just had to remember one thing, I think the most reliable sign that something is bogus is the last one. If somebody wants to sell you a treatment and they don't care to ever see you again, that's almost certainly bogus. Anybody who really is interested in science, is interested in trying to figure out if what they have works, they're going to want to see you again after they give it to you and measure some things to see what happened. But just like on the X-Files, some of these strange things might actually be true. So, do you remember some of those X-Files episodes when you left yourself wondering, what did I just see? One of my favorite ones was this one. There was this guy named Squeeze that was on a couple of episodes, and he had these green eyes, and he could squeeze his body down into small places, and they never did figure out what the deal was with that guy. They could never find a rational explanation. So just like that, some of these AOTs might just work. So why would I say that? Well, some of these things have very plausible mechanisms. Some of these things have, validated case reports suggesting dramatic recovery of lost motor function. Some of these things look pretty safe. A lot of times when I put this slide up and I look around at some of the clinicians or scientists in the audience, I see their eyes get kind of big, and I think this is not a common way for us to think about drug discovery, but it has happened before. Patients have accidentally discovered truly effective drugs in the past that scientists had no clue about. I'll give you two examples. I'm sure you've heard of Viagra. Did you know the story about Viagra? Pfizer was testing that drug for heart disease, and it didn't work. And at the end of the study, they were going to throw it away, until a bunch of the men said, "Doc, could I get a prescription to keep taking that after?" And it was only then that they said, "Holy cow, this drug does something that we had no idea, and it could turn out to be huge." And it's $1 billion drug, discovered by patients accidentally. Nudexa is another one. That's closer to home, ALS drug, right? We tested that to see if it slowed down the progression of ALS, and it didn't. But patients in that trial spontaneously came forward and said, "Wow, this has completely taken away that problem I was having with all that extra laughing and crying." So the company shifted gears, tested it for that, and it works, and it's FDA approved, and they're making money on it. So patients can discover things that worked, even when doctors and scientists didn't realize that might be a possibility. So let me just tell you quickly about a few of the things I'm particularly excited about that we've run into in this program. So one of them is this, called Lunacin. What is this? It's a soy peptide. It's taken orally. And the company says it can do a lot of things, which would make sense in ALS. It supposedly has some antioxidant properties, anti-inflammatory properties, and also can alter something called histone acetylation. Well, we know that people with ALS have excess amounts of neuroinflammation and oxidative stress, and we also know that the patterns of genes that are turned on inside their cells are very abnormal. They're what are called pro-apoptotic. Their cells are actually trying to commit suicide instead of turning on a pattern of genes that's protective. So maybe with something that was an antioxidant or an anti-inflammatory or something that could change that pattern, we might have something that slows down the disease. What's the evidence? Well, the evidence is this guy. His name is Mike McDuff. And he was in a news clip that somebody forwarded to me a couple of years ago in Providence, Rhode Island, reporting that he had ALS and that he was getting worse to the point where his speech was hard to understand and his swallowing was gone. He had to have a feeding tube and his arms and legs were getting much weaker. And somebody in his family said, why don't you try this? And a year later, his speech is normal. His swallowing's normal. He doesn't use his feeding tube anymore. His arms and legs are getting stronger. I have his medical records. His diagnosis appears to be sound, confirmed by 3 neurologists, including 2 from Mass General Hospital. His improvements are solid. He goes to an ALS clinic in Providence, Rhode Island. He has multiple therapists measuring multiple things, and they are all getting better. Seems to be safe. It is unfortunately rather expensive. To do exactly what Mike McDuff did is about $700 a month. Another one I'm excited about is called Protandim. This also comes from plants. It's 5 different plants mashed together into a pill. And what this does is activates a pathway called NRF2. And as a result of that pathway, you yourself start making more antioxidants. Now, unlike anything else that we've studied in the history of ALS Untangled, this mechanism has been proven in a peer-reviewed paper in humans. The company did a study of healthy people. They measured their blood levels of antioxidants before and after a dose of Protandim, and they significantly increased after the Protandim. So it gets a grade A for mechanism. The evidence here is, again, just one patient whose medical records I have, who really appears to have a sound diagnosis of ALS, was progressing but slowly, started taking Protandim, and now has started to recover lost motor function. Like, for example, could not button his shirts, and now he can button his shirts by himself. Side effects also seem to be very rare, and this one is much cheaper than Lunacin. It's only $50 a month. And last but not least, I want to tell you about the strangest of all the AOTs, and one that I still think is very exciting. It's called fecal transplants. So I was sitting at dinner one night with my wife when this came across my Twitter feed on my phone, and I immediately thought it must have been, a spelling error. And I showed it to my wife. I said, hey, look, somebody was asking about fetal transplants, fetal stem cells, and the thing spell corrected to fecal transplants. So I texted back, I said, you mean fetal, right? No, doc, fecal, like in poop. I said, what? I started reading about this, and much to my surprise, this is actually a mainstream treatment for certain diseases of the gut, like infections called Clostridium difficile, and even for Crohn's disease. And the idea is that some of these diseases might be caused by an alteration in the family of bacteria that live in the gut. That's called the microbiome. And so if you took the stool from a healthy person and then put it into the colon of the sick person, you might be able to reestablish a more normal family of bacteria in there and cure their disease. And it actually works for some of those gut diseases. There's papers in the New England Journal of Medicine. So what does this have to do with ALS? Well, again, there's a paper that's long forgotten that was published in 2005 where a guy named Longstreth said, I wonder if some people with ALS could have their disease because they get an overgrowth in their gut of something called Clostridium. This is a bacteria that is known to secrete a toxin which can leave the gut, cross the blood-brain barrier, and kill motor neurons. So it's a really interesting hypothesis. Is there any evidence for it? Well, never been a study. Finally now, studies of the microbiome in ALS are underway, which I think is really important. But there is this little nugget, which I think is fascinating. So I talked to people around the world on the phone that were doing fecal transplants, including this guy named Dr. Barity, who runs the world's largest fecal transplant clinic in Australia. And he said, there's a patient with ALS that he'll never forget who came there, was wheelchair bound, had been that way for years, and was there because his constipation was so bad his doctors thought this was worth a shot. So he gave him a fecal transplant. A couple days later, the guy walked back into the office. And a couple days after that, Barity saw him in Australia dancing with his wife. So I don't know exactly what happened. He had no records to give me. I could never find the patient, but it is fascinating. And there are examples of fecal transplants helping people with other neurological diseases, Parkinson's, MS, autism, dystonia, Alzheimer's, and even myasthenia gravis. Those are even published. This seems to be pretty safe, and it's, I would say, modestly expensive. Costs range from around $800 for a single treatment, which is not that much worse than some of the other things we use. So I just finish here with some of the challenges that we've had and how we've been addressing those very recently. As I showed you, we got a widening gap between the number of open and completed reviews. The number of open reviews is growing much faster than the number of completed reviews. Our website's getting really huge. I mean, if you go on there, it's kind of hard to figure out where to start. And I've heard some patients complain about that. I've had some of the proponents of AOTs complain that they don't feel like they have an opportunity to rebut some of the things that we said. I don't still exactly know how to measure how useful this program is, and up until just recently, we had no follow-up studies of some of these interesting AOTs. So what's changed? Well, 2014 really changed everything with the Ice Bucket Challenge. And I'm so grateful to the ALS Association for now being the major sponsor of the ALS Untangled program. And their $60,000 a year allows me to carve out a significant increase in time to spend on these so that we're doubling the number of reviews that we publish. We wanted to find a starting place for patients who come to our website for the first time. And so I worked with an ALS patient whose name you heard in the first talk, Eric Valor. He actually created an amazing animated short with original music to help patients and families understand how to go about using ALS Untangled to sift through all these AOTs. It's absolutely amazing to watch this. It's even more amazing to realize that Eric is completely paralyzed except for his eyes. He made an unbelievable animated movie with original music using only his eye movement. Absolutely amazing. In order to deal with this issue of rebuttals, what I decided to do is move our Twitter feed right onto the main page of our website. So if you go home and you say, poor Dr. Bedlack traveled all the way to Oregon and gave a disastrous talk, and you put that on Twitter, it's going to go on the main page of my website, and there's nothing I can do about it. So. And then usefulness. I still don't know exactly how to measure this, but I can tell you that people are reading our articles. So the ALS Journal keeps track of the most downloaded articles that it has ever published. So this is constantly updated, and it's just a running list of the most downloaded articles of all time. We've got the top 16 and 19 out of the top 20 most downloaded articles of all time in this journal. It does help that ours are free. And then last but not least, you may have read in the Wall Street Journal just last week that I started a new program to try to follow up some of these amazing cases of what I call ALS reversals. It's actually two programs. The first program is called ROAR, Replication of ALS Reversals. And in that program, I'm doing small pilot studies of exactly the same things that some of these patients did to themselves, correlating with when they got better. So for example, our first ROAR study is well underway, and we're doing exactly what Mike McDuff did with his Lunacy regimen to 50 more people. The other part of this program is called STAR. We don't know why these people got better. It may not have been the treatments, because I have yet to find two patients who did the same thing and had ALS reversals. I have a total of 23 validated ALS reversals, no two of which did the same thing. So there may be other explanations. Maybe these folks didn't have ALS in the first place. Now, I told you I validated these, but remember, there is no test that's 100% accurate for ALS. So by all I know, these people appear to have ALS from their medical records, but there could be something out there that's tricking us, something very rare that we don't know about yet. It's also possible that some of these people are genetically different, and to me, that's the most exciting possible explanation. Maybe there's a gene that's altered in some way in these people that makes them resistant to ALS. And it might sound far-fetched, but guess what? There's a precedent for this. So in HIV, there's a group of people called elite controllers. These are people who get infected with the HIV virus, but never get sick, and they never take any medicine. And we've known about them for 30 years. And finally, recently, somebody put all these people into the same database and looked at their genes, and a lot of them have the same genetic abnormality. It's an alteration in a gene called CCR5. And as a result of that alteration, a protein that's in the surface of all of our cells looks just a little bit different in those folks. And because of that, HIV cannot get into their cells. So we learned something new about the biology of HIV by studying this group. And Pfizer actually developed a drug that blocks that receptor, a CCR5 blocker, that helps everybody with HIV. So if these people did have a gene, and I could figure out what it was, maybe I could use that information to help everybody with ALS. So just to kind of conclude, investigation of AOTs is timely and important. As the X-Files used to say, the truth is out there, but it's not always easy to find. So this program is trying to bring clinicians and scientists and patients and families together using social networking to try to engage in shared decision making and help patients and families make more informed decisions about these things. We've learned some really interesting and unexpected lessons, including even some new ideas for research. We've had some challenges, but these are being addressed. So let's bring it back to our patient. One way this could go is we could try to engage in shared decision making with the help of an ALS Untangled review. They say, Samantha, that's a great question about hyperbaric oxygen. Other people have asked the same question. My group, ALS Untangled, has put together a whole review of this, and I'd ask you to take this home, and then maybe in a couple days we could follow up by telephone and talk about it. And so what our review found is hyperbaric oxygen is exposure to 100% oxygen at elevated pressures, usually like in a dive chamber. How might this work for ALS? Well, it has plausible mechanisms. It can be an antioxidant, it can be an anti-inflammatory, it can improve mitochondrial function, all of which makes sense in ALS. Is there any preclinical work? There was one positive trial that had many flaws done in the ALS mouse, the SOD1 mouse. When I say positive, it slightly prolonged survival. Are there any cases? There is one, the one I told you about in the beginning, a guy named Kim Cherry, who's on the internet reporting an ALS reversal. I found him, I found his medical records, he sent them to me. He really has ALS, and he really is getting stronger. But Kim Cherry did a lot more than just hyperbaric oxygen. So he does hyperbaric oxygen multiple times a week with his own chamber that he bought. He infuses himself with intravenous ozone. He's made major changes in his diet. He's made major changes in his attitude, his religion, all kinds of different things. Who knows which, if any of these things, might account for his ALS reversal. Unlike most of the things that ALS Untangled has looked at, there are actually trials of hyperbaric oxygen in ALS, which most people didn't know about. And the best of these trials was negative. It was no better than placebo. Furthermore, this actually has some significant risks, including ototoxicity, damage to the ears, deafness can occur. And so based on all this, it's pretty clear that we can't endorse this. We don't recommend that people with ALS pursue hyperbaric oxygen therapy, at least not on its own. So maybe Samantha's pretty impressed with that. It really hits home, and she decides, she's going to forget about that and come into one of the research studies. And maybe when she comes in, she has such a good experience. She gets all these great feelings, these feelings of helping other people, that she decides to become something called a research ambassador, to come to one of our clinical research learning institutes and to get educated on how to help other patients and families better understand research, and maybe someday we can improve our enrollment rate. So just like there were a lot of characters that made the X-Files great, I got a lot of characters to thank with ALS Untangled. Most importantly, patients and families. This program is really all about you. You give us the ideas, and you're the ones who read them, and you're the ones who provide feedback, so please keep doing that. Couldn't do it without the money from ALSA. Couldn't do it without all my colleagues around the world that helped me with the reviews. And that's the end of my talk today. I'm happy to answer any questions.